I have lived in my house for 20 years. I know this house the way you know something you have inhabited completely. Every room, every sound it makes in different weather, every morning light pattern through every window at every season. I know where the floor gives slightly under the hallway rug, and which drawer in the kitchen requires the specific lift and pull that my mother taught me years ago, and that I have never bothered to fix because it has become as familiar as anything else about the place. 20 years. My children grew up in this house. My marriage of 19 years has happened in this house. 3 dogs in succession have died in this house and been buried in the back garden under the oak tree that was already there when we bought it, and that has grown significantly since. I know this house. I did not know until a Tuesday morning in March that there was a second name on the title. The call came from my bank, a mortgage officer. Pleasant, efficient, the specific professional warmth of someone who deals with financial paperwork and has learned to deliver information in a way that does not alarm unnecessarily. She said, "Mrs. Hartley, I'm calling to let you know that the refinancing process is moving forward. We'll need both owners to sign the new documentation." I said, "Both owners?" She said, "Yes, yourself and the co-owner on the title." I said, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" She said, "The co-owner. The title on record shows 2 names. We'll need signatures from both parties to proceed." I said, "What is the second name?" She told me. I did not recognize it. I have been in this house for 20 years, and I did not recognize the name of the person who had been on the title with me for all of them. I want to tell you about the 48 hours between that phone call and my first conversation with the attorney, because they were the 48 hours in which I assembled what I could assemble before I had the framework to understand what I was assembling. The first thing I did was call my husband. James answered on the second ring. I told him what the bank had said. There was a silence that I want to be precise about. Not the silence of surprise, not the sharp intake of a person who has just been told something they did not know, a different kind of silence, longer than surprise, weighted in a way that surprise is not. I said, "James?" He said, "Claire?" I said, "Do you know this name?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Who is it?" He said, "Can I come home? I want to tell you in person." I said, "Tell me now." He said, "It's complicated." I said, "James, someone has been on the title of our house for 20 years and apparently has been making payments against the mortgage for 20 years, and I have never heard their name. Tell me who it is." He said, "It's my father." I need to tell you about James's father before I tell you what James told me, because the father is where the story actually begins, and without him, nothing else makes sense. Edward Hartley had died 6 years before James and I bought the house. He had died when James was 22, a heart attack, sudden, the kind that gives no warning and leaves the people around it in the specific shock of something that was not anticipated and for which there was no preparation. James did not talk about his father often. When he did, it was with the specific, contained grief of someone who has processed a loss over many years and who has arrived at a place where the loss is present, but no longer raw. Edward had been, by James's account, a man of modest means who had worked carefully and saved quietly and had built, over a working life, a small but real amount of financial stability. He had left James and his sister an inheritance that was meaningful but not large. James had used his portion to pay the deposit on our house. What James had not told me, what he had apparently not told me for 20 years, was that the deposit had not been the only thing Edward had left. Edward had also left a letter and a standing instruction with his attorney. James came home at noon. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the table that had been in this kitchen for 15 years, that we had eaten 20 years of dinners at, that I had sat at with our children and our dogs and the accumulation of the ordinary life of a marriage, and he told me. He told me for an hour. I did not interrupt him. I let him tell it in the order he needed to tell it because I could see that the telling was something he had been carrying for a long time and that the shape of it mattered to him, and I was not going to disrupt the shape. Edward's letter had been given to James by the attorney on the day Edward's estate was settled. James had been 22. He had read the letter in the attorney's office, and he had made a decision in the minutes after reading it that he had not revisited in any meaningful way in the 20 years since. The letter said this. James read it to me. He had kept it. It was in his study in an envelope he had not opened in years, but which he had brought to the kitchen table. James, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the business with Hargreaves is finished. You should know that I have made an arrangement. I had a relationship, many years ago, before your mother, that I am not proud of, and that I ended badly, and that I have spent the subsequent years trying to address correctly. The arrangement with Hargreaves is the current form of that addressing. When you buy a home, a third of the cost will be matched by the Hargreaves account, and the monthly obligation will be shared for as long as the arrangement runs. I ask only that you not refuse it, and that you not seek to understand it further than this letter explains. Some things are better understood at a distance. Your father. I sat with this for a long time. The Hargreaves account, a name I had never heard, a relationship Edward had not been proud of, an arrangement that had been running for 20 years and that had placed a name on the title of my house without my knowledge and without, I was now understanding, my husband's full understanding of what it meant. I said, "You knew. For 20 years you knew there was another name on the title." James said, "I knew there was an arrangement. I didn't think about it the way you're thinking about it now. It was my father's thing. It was settled before we moved in. The payments came from a separate account and they went to the bank directly, and He stopped. I said, "You didn't tell me." He said, "No." I said, "For 20 years." He said, "I know." I said, "James." He said, "I know, Claire. I know." I called my attorney that afternoon, Sandra, who had become over the years the person I called when the situation was real and required someone who would not flinch. I told her what had happened in the calm, ordered way I told difficult things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The co-owner, the Hargreaves account, you need to know who is actually behind it." I said, "My husband's letter says his father had a relationship before his mother, that he ended badly." Sandra said, "A child would explain the arrangement. If Edward had a child from that relationship, a child he felt an obligation to without wanting to disclose the relationship, structuring support as a shared property arrangement would be one way to fulfill that obligation quietly." I said, "My husband has a sibling he doesn't know about." Sandra said, "Possibly, or the arrangement could be with the person from the relationship directly, or with an estate connected to them." She said, "I can find out. Give me a few days." I said, "How do I handle the bank in the meantime?" She said, "Tell them there's a documentation question and you need to pause the refinancing. That's true, and it gives us time." I said, "Sandra, 20 years." She said, "I know. Let me find out who this is before you decide what to do with the 20 years." Sandra called me on a Friday. She said, "I have an answer. Are you sitting down?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "The Hargreaves account is managed by an estate. The estate belongs to a woman named Margaret Hargreaves who died 11 years ago. Before she died, she had established a trust with specific instructions. The trust was to continue making the mortgage contributions for the duration of the loan." I said, "She's been dead for 11 years. Sandra said, "The trust has been making the payments automatically for 11 years. The instructions were specific enough that no human decision-making has been required." I said, "Who was she?" Sandra said, "She was a schoolteacher. She lived in the same town where Edward grew up. She never married. She had one child, a son, who died in childhood." She paused. She said, The child's name was James. I said, "My husband's name is James." Sandra said, "Yes." I said, "Edward named his son after her son." Sandra was quiet. She said, "That is what the evidence suggests." I said, "He had a child with her. The child died, and he named his next son, James, after the child he lost." Sandra said, "That is my reading of it." I said, "And she, Margaret, she knew about James, our James?" Sandra said, "She established the trust when James was 2 years old. She knew about him." I said, "She spent 20 years paying into a house she had never been in for a child who was named after the son she had lost by a man who had ended the relationship badly and was trying to address it correctly." Sandra said, "Yes." I sat at the kitchen table. I thought about Edward's letter. Some things are better understood at a distance. I thought about Margaret Hargreaves, a schoolteacher who never married, who had lost a son, who had spent 11 years making monthly payments into a trust that automatically contributed to the mortgage of a house she had never been in for a boy named James, who was named after her James, because a man she had loved and lost had decided this was how he would try to address it correctly. I said, "She never contacted us." Sandra said, "No. The trust instructions specifically prohibited any contact. The only condition was the continued contribution." I said, "She just paid." Sandra said, "For as long as she lived, and for 11 years after." I told James that evening. All of it. Margaret Hargreaves, the school teacher, the son who died, his name. He sat at the kitchen table and he listened, and he did not say anything for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "She named her son James." I said, "And your father named you James." He said, "He was trying to—" I said, "He was trying to address it correctly. That's what he wrote." James was quiet. He said, "She never contacted us." I said, "The trust specifically prohibited it." He said, "She could have. She was alive until 11 years ago. She could have found a way." I said, "She honored the instruction." He said, "Why? Why would she honor an instruction that kept her from—" He stopped. He said, "Because she understood something about what my father was trying to do, and she respected it." I said, "I think so." He said, "That's—" He stopped again. He said, "That's an enormous amount of grace." I said, "Yes." We sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet around us in the specific way that houses are quiet when the people in them have just understood something new about the ground they had been standing on. 20 years, the same house, the same table, the same floor that gives slightly under the hallway rug. And underneath all of it, for all of it, a woman we had never met, making a monthly contribution to the place we called home. Not for the house, for James. For a boy named after the son she had lost. We found Margaret Hargreaves' grave. It was not difficult to find. She was buried in the town where she had grown up, and where Edward had grown up, and where the thing between them had happened and ended badly and been carried forward for the rest of both their lives. James and I drove there on a Saturday in April, 2 hours. We did not talk much on the drive. There was not much to say that had not already been said. The grave was simple. Her name, the dates, a small stone, well kept in the way of graves that someone has been tending. We learned later that a neighbor had been doing it, a woman who had known Margaret and who had continued after she died, out of the simple, ordinary loyalty of someone who had been a friend. James stood at the grave for a long time. I stood beside him. He said, "I don't know what to say to her." I said, "You don't have to say anything." He said, "She paid into our house for 20 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "She just wanted me to have a home." I said, "That's right." He was quiet. Then he said, very quietly to the stone, "Thank you." 2 words, the only ones that were adequate. We drove home, 2 hours, the same house, the same floor, the same kitchen table. The house that Margaret Hargreaves had quietly helped us keep for 20 years.
I want to say something about the bank call. A mortgage officer, pleasant, efficient, calling about a refinancing application. The most ordinary of financial conversations, and in the middle of it, we'll need both owners to sign. Both owners. That is all it took. 1 sentence from a bank officer doing her job correctly, following the documentation on file, noting that there were 2 names on the title and that both were needed. 1 sentence and 20 years opened up. I think about this sometimes, about how many things are sitting quietly under the surface of ordinary life, how many arrangements have been made by people we will never know for reasons we cannot fully understand that shape the ground we stand on without our knowing. The house was the house. I knew the house. I did not know what the house was built on. Now I do. And what it is built on is more than I expected, and more complicated than I would have chosen, and more moving than I know how to say. Margaret Hargreaves wanted James to have a home. He has one. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. Sometimes rising is a bank call on a Tuesday morning that opens 20 years. Sometimes the most important thing is not what is visible, but what has been quietly underneath it all along. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Have you ever discovered something about your life that had been true all along without your knowing? I read every single one.